Myth history. Okay. Myth history has a special place in the foundation of states. Without a myth history, states find it difficult to survive, let alone prosper in the long run. Myth history includes two things of importance. First, from the side of history, it deals with hinges. There are the moments and also the places, the settings, where great historical shifts take place. These have a monumental drama that ordinary history, let alone ordinary life, does not possess. This is the kind of history in which great forces are arrayed against each other. The rise of the Roman Empire out of the Republic, the Wars of the Roses, the American Civil War, and so on. Second, from the side of literature, myth history has heroes. Some are purely heroes of legend, like Achilles and Hector. Others are less literally mythical, but no less legendary for that. Julius Caesar and Henry V, Abraham Lincoln and Winston Churchill. These are great characters. I don't mean that they are saints or that they are unconquerable, but nonetheless they have their hands on the hinges of history. They can move those hinges, if not always very far, but sometimes very far indeed. Those who move history are not moral heroes. They are capable of very ruthless action if necessary, but they are not ordinary political figures either. They bear the weight of foundation. To shift history is to turn it like a giant stone, straining with and against the necessity of bearing that weight. In these figures, freedom and necessity are reconciled. Indeed, it may be unclear in the deeds of great historical figures where freedom ends and necessity begins. That is the inner character of myth history. It deals with what is enigmatic, with what is ambivalent to the point where opposites turn into each other. Abraham Lincoln, the American president who was reluctant to sign execution orders for deserters, was an unyielding prosecutor of the Civil War and urged resolute action on his generals, not all of whom were decisive. That enigmatic quality, as it emerges in the course of great conflict, is the difference between myth history and other kinds of stories. Only myth histories can create the foundation of states that are both durable and energetic. Like the characters that make them come alive, foundations are themselves enigmatic. In a very obvious sense, foundations are the beginning of the history of a great society. But foundations are also the anchor of the continuity of that state. Thus, what begins is made to last. Myth history is the story of acts of foundation that endure and are endlessly embellished. There is a continuity of the English state from the time of the Tudors until today. Everything changes, of course, and sometimes markedly, and even traumatically, and yet some things stay the same. That is the enigma of history. Shakespeare's English history plays tell us about the long prologue that runs up to the emergence of the Tudor dynasty. Here we see the English, later British archetype in formation and all of the chaos that precedes its order. Let us not be mistaken about it. There are few truly successful states. Most are failures, some conspicuously so, or else they dwell on the margins of history, inconspicuous and barely remembered. We pay them scant attention while we scrutinise every aspect of great states, paying particular attention to their flaws. Shakespeare's myth history tells us in no uncertain terms just how difficult the birth of a great state is. Painful sacrifice is the midwife of auspicious birth. Except that auspicious is hardly the right word if we look at the mess and chaos from which world historic states seem to blunder forth. The era of the War of the Roses is a period of aristocratic suicide as the English feudal ruling class cannibalised itself. Who would have predicted in the middle of this the glories of the Tudor state? A character like Francis Bacon seems inconceivable in the era of Henry VI. Yet snatches of English glory are already evident in the character of Henry V, whose victory snatched from defeat at Agincourt against the French sets the tone for a distinctively English character, neither Anglo-Saxon nor Norman, neither Southern nor Northern. Neither Anglo-Saxon nor Norman, neither Southern nor Northern. If this dissipates in the Wars of the Roses, it will rise again. What is at stake here is not glory in war, or victory in war, but national character or collective character. Dictatorships and totalitarian states glorify war, but the real lesson of war is how unpredictable it is, how much it is ruled by fortune, or, in more mythic terms, how much it is ruled by the maliciousness and capriciousness of the gods. National character is not a national talent for bellicosity, but the capacity to endure fortune of all kinds, even the most extreme kinds to be found in war. If the English came to be represented by the stiff upper lip, this was because the lip was the embodiment of a vernacular stoicism. This stoicism was an essential part of national forbearance. It is interesting to observe how victory is not the most essential ingredient in the myth history of a state. A nation in orderly retreat, Britain at Dunkirk, or a nation under siege, England at the time of the Battle of Britain, is more important ultimately than simple victory. Victory against all odds, not victory per se, turns Churchill from failed politician into immortal hero. Remember that it was the defeated Trojans whose alliance with the Latins provides the basis for the national myth of the Romans. The Trojan hero Aeneas escapes from the sacked city of Troy and eventually is betrothed to Lavinia, the daughter of King Latinus. The alliance of the Trojans and the Latins is decided in combat. Aeneas must fight for Lavinia against Turnus, the king of the Rutulians, to whom she had been promised. Aeneas wins, but it is victory that began in defeat and flight from Troy. What this points to again is the enigma of myth history. It is not about either victory or defeat. It is not triumphal history. It is not victim history. It is not black or white, but many shades of grey. It is history in which victory arises out of defeat and defeat is snatched from the jaws of victory. As Hannah Arendt observed so pointedly of Homer's Iliad, it is not composed from the standpoint of one side. If it is myth, it is remarkably objective myth. The Trojans and the Achaeans both are brave and foolish, ruthless and lamented. If you believe the idea that the Trojans were a proto-Greek people, like the Achaeans, then such even-handedness makes eminent sense. I do not mean that it is only possible to give an objective account of one's own kind. Rather and more simply, it is evident that the Trojans and the Achaeans possessed something in common, namely character. Character is a discipline of a free people. The Greeks of later generations could win against the Persian armies that vastly outnumbered them because they had this paradoxical discipline of a free people. Persia, in contrast, was a slave society. Character is one of those enigmatic, paradoxical, quizzical qualities that make a great people great. It is a quality that is visceral and at the same time almost inexplicable. Character is the human counterweight to fate. War, it needs be stressed, is not, though, just a theatre of character. It is also a struggle over things. The Trojans and the Achaeans were fighting over something. Troy, like the Gallipoli peninsula not far away from it, is one of the hinges of the world. It is a geopolitical switching point. Troy and Gallipoli are separated by a narrow waterway, the Dardanelles. This waterway is a hinge between Europe and Asia and between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. For the Proto-Greek Achaeans of the Mycenaean age, it is or was the dividing line between their world and the Asian world of the Hittite Empire. It was also the passage from the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea. In the ancient world, indeed until the coming of rail transport in the 19th century, sea transport and sea passage was the primary building block of any sophisticated political economy. Any political economy in any society that wanted to avoid either total dependence on slavery or on patrimony. Control of waterways was essential to any state with any margin of freedom, even if only the freedom of heroes. It is true that slave states developed forms of water patrimony or hydraulic despotism, but states that had any substantial element of freedom were maritime states. They depended on shipping lanes. Freedom began with the freedom of the seas. Freedom was sustained by keeping the seas open, and that meant not least of all by controlling the seas and entrances to the seas. Freedom thus often led to empire. In later Greek history, in the age of Pericles, Athens, the greatest of the Greek city-states, built a maritime empire in order to control the grain trade with the Black Sea. The Venetians did much the same to ensure their trade with Constantinople. There's good reason, by analogy, to think that the Trojan War was also a battle to control a waterway, the waterway that today we call the Dardanelles. That battle was conducted on land, at least in the account of the Iliad, but Troy, or Ilios, was located close to the waterway in a position to be able to tax, extort tribute, regulate or otherwise control access through the maritime passage. For any state that is dependent on maritime power, and many, if in fact most great states fall into this category, the control of such watery hyphens is highly sensitive. On it the prosperity, fortune, and in some elemental way the ethos of the state rests. Was not then the beauty of Helen the cause of the Trojan War? Is the story of Helen and Paris just one of those myths that we smile at? Well, of course, literature must embody history and geopolitics in human character, in human gallantry and squeamishness. But beauty is both a visceral quality and a philosophical character of history. We know beauty in the flesh. We also know that wars are fought for abstractions like beauty, goodness and truth. Or do we? If I was to ask them, many of my peers would snort and tell me with their characteristic assurance that wars are only fought for the control of waterways and other mundane things of geopolitics. For myself, I'm not sure that the answer is either or. I'm not sure that philosophical abstractions can be separated so neatly from concrete realities in either direction, just as I'm not sure that beauty in the flesh is so different from the philosopher's beauty. It's not implausible that a Trojan prince did visit an Aegean king and did steal away with his beautiful wife. We will allow poets their license, of course, but breaking the norm of hospitality is a cause for war. The norm of hospitality was one of the few effective norms regulating relations between strangers in the archaic world. To the extent that Atia was Proto-Greek, it is also a plausible supposition that beauty played its part as a cause for war as well. For at least as far as the later Greeks are concerned, everything could be translated into questions of beauty, even war. It was entirely conceivable to the Greeks that a war could be fought for beauty. This is different from the standard explanation of war by our contemporaries. They principally view the causes of war as ignoble. Myth history, in contrast, does not automatically suppose the mercenary nature of war. I don't think that in any way hides the savage nature of war. Indeed, whether waged for beauty or profit, war is carnage. It is seas of blood and shores of gore. But myth history does give an account of the things over and above themselves that human beings are prepared to live and die for. Beauty and hospitality are not bad motives, all things considered. One can imagine living well in a world that is beautiful and hospitable. Having said that, though, there are indeed mercenary wars, and some are extremely vile. There are also wars conducted for perverted ideals. Joseph Conrad's stories, Nostromo, which he wrote in 1904, and Heart of Darkness, his work of 1899, are superb accounts of such mercenary decadence. By the time Conrad published The Secret Agent in 1907, the mercenary soul, as he had observed it, had morphed into the nihilist psyche that we've become so familiar with in late modernity. The Kurtz character in The Heart of Darkness is a transitional figure between these two worlds. Let me just quote a passage here up on the slide. This visitor informed me Kurt's proper sphere ought to have been politics on the popular side. How that man could talk. He electrified large meetings. He had faith, don't you see? He had the faith. He could get himself to believe anything. Anything. He would have been a splendid leader of an extreme party. What party, I asked. Any party, answered the other. He was an extremist. Did I not think so? I assented. Now, Conrad is a terrific storyteller, but he is not Shakespeare or Homer. The difference is myth history. The story of Gallipoli illustrates the difference. It is myth history. Gallipoli as history is an interesting case. It was a sideshow of World War I. The war of 1914 to 1918 tore Europe apart. This was a war born of nihilism. The most potent and lethal of the many dangerous ideologies that were to consume and ultimately destroy Europe after the French Revolution. Now, Conrad had seen the European future, or at least a version of the European future, already in the 1890s in the Belgian Congo. 2 centuries after the Enlightenment, darkness was starting to envelope Europe. Atrocities like those that Conrad had heard about while travelling in the Congo would soon engulf Europe itself, though in truth they would turn out to be of a different, much worse kind than those perpetrated in King Leopold's hellhole. For these crimes, the crimes of Europe, were not simply the results of slave empire or human greed, nor indeed were they simply some version of aristocratic age militancy recast as industrial age militarism. No, something much more malicious and much more malign than this was at play. A dark pathological modernity was taking shape. Absorption in horror for its own sake may be one way of understanding this. A new form of rule by death or thanatocracy, was on the rise. In the case of the Europeans, it was marked by a loss of restraint and a slide into spiritual darkness, madness and depravity. Seemingly, there was no stopping this. So far as the dyspeptic Conrad was concerned, by the end of the 1890s, corruption, chaos and destruction had become already universal. Everyone was self-serving. The English and Italian expatriates in Nostromo, with their dangerous egos running amok, ruin South America. They are no different in kind from the continental Europeans back home. Everything and everyone in Conrad's world is tainted. There is no nobility, just Euro trash of various kinds, whose seedy imperialism masks an inner void. There is nothing beneath their surface. This void, the opening of a dark, yawning abyss of nothing, led to the suicide of Europe. It unleashed the totalitarian dictatorships of the 20th century that destroyed Europe as a cultural and political force and left it, after it was all over, an empty shell of creation, slumbering in a quiet golden twilight as it depopulates, no less afflicted by void than it was in 1914, but no longer ready to cultivate atrocity as the cure for its inward emptiness. In 1914, it was different. The taste for atrocity was very much alive. The Great War unfolded as a dance macabre. This mechanical ballet of death would have been comic had it not been catastrophic. It began with a local conflict. Austria at war with Serbia. Germany backed Austria. Russia backed Serbia. This triggered a German declaration of war against Russia. The French, who were allies of the Russians, declared against the Germans. German war planners prescribed that in the case of war with France and Russia, Germany would seize Belgium. It would do this so that it could move its troops swiftly into France, defeat the French army, and then turn its guns on the Russians. The idiocy of this ought to be a lesson to anyone who thinks that war can or should be conducted by plans. When the German Kaiser suggested to his chief of staff that perhaps Germany should not invade France because it would bring Britain into the war, the reply from the chief of staff was simple: a plan once settled cannot be altered. Germany's violation of Belgian neutrality did indeed bring Britain into the war. Yet the cause of war was not just the violation of an international treaty, which Britain and France had with Belgium to maintain its neutrality, any more than it was the naval arms race that had been escalating for a decade between the British and the Germans. No. Something else, something more unsettling, something much more pernicious was involved. Those with political sensitivity realised very quickly that a threshold, an invisible line, was crossed when Germany invaded Belgium. This was no ordinary invasion. 100,000 Belgian citizens were conscripted to German factories. In itself, this act pales before the 10 million killed by forced labour in the Belgian Congo. But something else was going on as well, something more than the archaic appetite for slave labour. 5,000 Belgian citizens were slaughtered by Germans, and if it had not been for American food aid, hundreds of thousands of others would have starved to death. These acts were not carried out as part of a war of conquest against an armed force, or indeed in order to put down an armed insurrection. This was not even a religiously charged pogrom like the medieval European massacres of the Jews. Rather, it was systematic political murder. It was a politically orchestrated atrocity against an unarmed civilian population. It was also the prologue for the same on a much larger scale. The massacre of 1.5 million Armenians by the Ottoman Turkish government between 1915 and 1923. The scale of this crime was so great that in May 1915, Britain, France and Russia issued a joint official statement that for the first time ever accused another government of committing a crime against humanity. In the same period, the Ottomans killed 350,000 Pontian Greeks in massacres, forced labour and death marches, and 275,000 Assyrians. To put this in some perspective, the widespread anti-Semitic riots in Russia from 1903 to 1906 resulted in the deaths of 2,000 Jews. The Russian secret police tolerated this homicidal rioting and probably connived in it to some extent. But the Ottoman massacres are of a different type altogether. They were organised by the Ottoman state. This action was a prelude for the Nazi Holocaust. The late Ottoman state is the world's first thanocratic state. But of course, many more were to follow in the 20th century, and indeed, as we know, in the 21st century as well. It is as a myth-historical response to this that we can best understand the battle for Gallipoli. The Gallipoli campaign was beset by the usual folly and miscalculations, carnage and bad fortune that afflict any war, even the most successful ones. The Gallipoli campaign, though, was not a success. Like the Great War itself, it turned into a bloody stalemate of opposing forces. Winston Churchill was its instigator. He paid a suitable political price for its failure. However, we should not confuse the failure of a campaign with its rationale. Churchill observed with genuine horror the vicious stalemate of troops dug into the trenches in Flanders. He was determined to find a way to end that stalemate. As it turned out, this was only achieved when the Americans entered the war on the side of the British and the French. The consequence of not ending the stalemate was unending slaughter. Churchill, who had a stomach for war and enjoyed a battle, was appalled by this. At the time he figured, and reasonably enough, that military gridlock could only be ended by an attack on Germany from the east by Russia. But for this to succeed, Russia would have to be supplied with industrial age weapons. Key to the supply of Russia was the Dardanelles. Alternate routes such as the Baltic, the White Sea and the Sea of Okhotsk were either blockaded by Germany or else obstructed by ice. However, the British strategy, Churchill's strategy, was frustrated when Germany and Ottoman Turkey entered into a military alliance. Germany took command of the Ottoman navy and army. Britain countered with Churchill's plan to capture Constantinople and to hand it over to the Russians. The sequence of events that followed had the British checkmated at every step. The British fleet headed towards Constantinople in February 1915, but the Turkish navy mined the Dardanelles. The British then needed to clear the waterway using minesweepers. To do this, though, they first had to remove the Turkish artillery high up on the Gallipoli Peninsula. So they landed Allied troops on the peninsula beaches in April 1915. This only produced yet another stalemate. The Thracian, Anatolian and Arab troops under the command of Liman von Sanders, the German commander, and Mustafa Kemal, later to become Ataturk, stopped the Allies advancing. In November 1915, the Ottomans passed a note to the Allies saying, "We can't advance, you can't advance, what are you going to do?" In December, the Allies evacuated. The 9 months of fighting, 86,000 Ottoman soldiers died, along with 20,000 British, 10,000 French, 8,000 Australians, 2,000 New Zealanders and 1,000 Indians. In all, the Allies deployed 500 and over 500,000 troops, and the Ottomans 310,000 troops. 44,000 Allied troops were killed and twice that number on the Ottoman side. Churchill's Dardanelles strategy became badly unstuck. It came unstuck on the hinge of history. On a clear day, the site of ancient Troy can be seen from the Gallipoli Peninsula. Both are screws on history's hinge. Both look out towards the Dardanelles. Both were settings of two great myth-historical battles. What makes these conflicts myth-historical? I'll end on this question. One measure is their resonance. Virgil's national myth of Rome is an offshoot of the struggle over Troy. Gallipoli is the founding fragment in what looks like will become a vast epic cycle to defeat the viral armies and vampire ambitions of nihilist modernity. We are all bit players in this unfolding epic cycle. Where are we in its peculiar time? Who can tell? If Gallipoli is the Homeric moment in this epic, then the Virgilian moment lies a long way ahead of us. Thank you.
I always have a problem with this Gallipoli thing. You know, recently in Australia it has become a political issue. I think that the Keating government, the Labour government in the 80s and early 90s, tried to, how can I say that, to bring other myths, foundational myths for Australia.
Yeah.
And I think especially the Aboriginal case, you know, in 1988, the bicentenary, with an amazing history by Manning Clark, where the actual people, the ordinary people, the common man, as you remember, established this country. Since the 90s, we've seen this revival of sort of a triumphal, this is a traumatic event, but it's presented as a heroic incident. It's a traumatized event. Remember that the last surviving soldiers of that campaign didn't want to participate in any of the celebrations, memorials throughout. The last one who died in Perth 2 years ago, he was appalled when they told him that he had to participate too. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. How do you express this national masochism with remembering the most disastrous event in the history as a foundational myth of a political body, of a society?
Well, I think it's interesting. I remember as a child growing up here and puzzling about that very question about a society which on the surface of it takes a defeat in war as its point of departure. And but I guess today I'm more inclined to see this as neither a victory nor a defeat, but merely, I mean, is that sort of statement towards the end from the Turkey side. We can't advance, you can't advance, what are you going to do about it? And I think one of the things that makes Gallipoli myth-historical, gives it a certain mythic potency, is ultimately it's neither a victory nor a defeat. It's not black or white, it's both. And I mean, it's not the only thing that gives it its potency, but that certainly is one thing. And what follows from that is the immense amount of different readings that can be given to it. I mean, one of the readings you just indicated there is the reading of the person who participates in the horrible event who says, I want nothing to do with this, which is perfectly understandable. I mean, even in a very ordinary, everyday sense, you're involved in a bad car accident. You do not want to return to not only the scene of the trauma, but you do not wish to be reminded of that. And indeed, I mean, one of the things that I go on to talk about, I mean, in later, when I talk in later parts of this about war and soldiers at war, is the peculiar way in which war is very personal, in a way that the geopolitical and the world historic settings of war are not. And so that what the reasons that states go to war, be they for whatever reason, the most justified, the least justified, often become irrelevant to the actual experience of the soldiers in the battlefield. And the other point that I would make, and that's really not the discussion for this debate that I've given today, but it's certainly central, not just to the nature of war, but also to the experience of Gallipoli. It's clear that there is two stories that interweave themselves here. The experience of the soldier, the individual soldier at war, and the large geopolitical and world historical context. And they have a very odd relationship with each other. And just a final point about the politics of this. Gallipoli is the Australian Myth of Foundation in a way that exceeds and goes beyond any attempt to politically orchestrate this. And there's no other story in Australia that has the kind of resonance with ordinary Australians. Now, that also means that any national myth will at times be deployed politically, because I think quite properly there is a relationship between such a myth and the politics of the day, and it's part of what the function of national myths is. It provides a framework in which other kinds of discourses, including political discourses, are conducted. But I think the thing about the Gallipoli myth is that what gives it its power is not its capacity to be mobilised by any particular political party or lobby group or any of those kinds of things, but that everybody can plug into it. And so that you can get people who use it to remonstrate against war or for war, or a whole multitude and myriad of positions that actually are located in between those two things. But in the end, simply the fact that spontaneously Australians in very large numbers increasingly go to the Gallipoli Peninsula each year without orchestration indicates, I think, how serious this is as a mythology, how deep it now runs in the country, and that future politics, future statecraft cannot ignore that fact in a way that no statecraft can ignore the national foundations of the state. And I'll make one further comment, though, is that this is a national foundational story that has deep echoes through the politics, history and social organisation of Europe and the Middle East and a variety of other places, which again is has a kind of extraordinary potency about it.
But you see, there's a ritualised thanatophilia. I think, well, I use the word thanatophilia. It's a thanatophilia there, you know, it's something which effectively does not take in account the pain of the people who died. I think it's a political orchestrated spectacle, essentially. And every year it's so... I mean, you can see the Australians went until last year there. They were sleeping on the graves. They were drinking beer. They were dancing on the graves because they didn't know what happened there. They thought it was a celebration. I think in Australia we can't celebrate, we can't distinguish between celebration and commemoration.
I think that may be, in some sense, a national characteristic, and I think that's quite an interesting observation. That may be possible.
I do not want to speak about Australia, but about the general
sure.
problem that is here. I don't know whether it would not be better, perhaps, to distinguish between foundational myths and master narratives. My idea is basically that both foundational myths you enumerated, basically Troy, on the one hand, and Gallipoli on the other hand, they are master narratives. Master narratives, in a way, give impetus for imagination. There's a frame of imagination on the one hand, but you cannot return to it. And when you speak about the foundation, a foundation is something which the ancient myth you can return to. Sometimes you must return to in a revolution. So I think I rather accept Machiavelli that when you speak about foundations, there is a master narrative of all Greeks. This is basically Trojan War. But for the Athenians, it is Theseus who is the founding father. And Lycurgus is the founding father for Sparta. That is, the foundation happens with giving a law, an institution to a world. This is the real foundation. And Machiavelli says the foundation for the Romans is, of course, Brutus, the Republican, and for Jews it is Moses. We can even in the latter case distinguish. Master narrative starts with Adam and Eve, but foundation is the foundation through the law. So I think that this distinction makes sense. And I don't know whether you believe it makes sense or you may distinguish between the two.
It's a very interesting comment, and I'd say that I think one of the issues, because I am interested in casting this in terms of the Australian Myth of Foundation, and I think one of the things that that suggests is that, well, my response is to say Australia has no founding father. There is no Solon, indeed there is no Jefferson in the kind of the sense of Australian statecraft. And I made allusion to that right at the beginning when I said that there is no equivalence here in terms of the making of the Constitution. And so I think all I'd say about that here is that what you raised there is, I think, central to kind of understanding something very important about the Australian Foundation. That is to say that there simply is not a founding father for a variety of reasons, which I don't think it's worth going into. It's not there, and it's one of the peculiarities of the place. David?
Well, I disagree strongly with what you're saying. I think that we do have to take into account Agnes's distinction between what we might call the foundation through law and the historical version. It seems probably clear that societies need both. I'm not sure about that, but it seems to me there is very clearly a foundation in law, and one which was in fact endorsed by public referendum. That is the Act of Federation.
Yeah.
And this Act of Federation is the only way that a nation which is constituting itself and continues to constitute itself through an intake of migrants can define itself. That is to say, Gallipoli may have resonances for the ordinary Australian, but who is the ordinary Australian? The ordinary Australian of the 1930s is very different from the ordinary Australian of a massive increase in population since 45. Now, I've spent most of my life in Australia, but Gallipoli does not have a resonance for me. It has only the resonance of heroism in battle, which is equally true of the whole horror story of the First World War. It was a very interesting thing I heard driving from the conference yesterday, and that was somebody from the return services talking about a battle which went on exactly at this moment in time on the French front, where a large number of Australian soldiers died, and one of the and they gave an account of survivors of the battle, and in it was they're basically massacred as they advance, and then they rally and they go on to their death. And one of the survivors said, "And that moment we were all Australians because we wanted to die together and live together." And the other moment is, of course, the one that is brought up very well in the film Gallipoli, where they're given the order to charge, and they know that they will charge to their death. And this is the moment of the proof through fire, where they go to their death.
That's right.
And this is the blood which, as it were, gives one form of identity to the nation. But it's only the one, and it's not a sufficient form. You must have the foundation through law, and especially in a society where, for the great majority, Gallipoli can have no resonance in the same way, I suggest.
I think it's an interesting question, and it's something that I've thought about quite a lot. And again, the thing that I am aware of is that the foundation in law, and this is partly because I spent much time thinking about that in the American case, is that there really is not anything in what you might broadly call narrative or dramatic terms that equates in the Australian case with the foundation in law of the American case. I mean, there's a very interesting story about Macquarie, He was one of, in a sense, the first civilising governor and the creator of Sydney and so on. Which is a moderately interesting story. And the story of the Constitution is largely a procedural story. It's not bound up with either war or revolution as it is in the case of the United States. And in the end, to the extent that the myth history requires a dramatic structure, that simply means that it is the Gallipoli story, even if it is one-sided, which is most clearly has that kind of dramatic structure, which is fundamental to national self-understanding. And I don't know, both what you and Agnes have raised, I have no issue with in a million. But I'm not sure what the long-term implications of that are. I mean, I know that, but I mean, one of the ironies about the Australian case is that our legal democracy, our constitutional democracy, is relatively unproblematic. It's deep going, it's not an issue, it's consensual, everybody adapts to it, each wave of, each migrant wave gets on happily basically within its framework. And so it's a kind of something that almost exists there in an unreflective way, by contrast with the Gallipoli story and the issues of war and Australia's relationship with the broader world. There's much more in contention, competing narratives, competing interpretations, conflict about this. People are much more ready to become uneasy about the question of war whenever that's raised, and it will be in the end raised within the framework of the Gallipoli story, than they are about the procedural democracy we have here. In a sense, we are a rulesian society because we simply assume certain ways of going about it, the rule of law, the procedure of regular elections, and we're very good at doing that, and that is kind of uncomplicated. But the thing that sort of charges, political discourse lies on the side of the Gallipoli story rather than the constitutional story, and it's an oddity. I mean, at various times I've tried to write the question of foundation from the standpoint of law, democracy, and constitution, and have hit a brick wall in attempting to do that. One more question, then we have to
just a
brief comment.
I think the problem with the Gallipoli, in this sense, and in your response, is that it hides the great achievement of Australia, its true foundational myth, which is to have created a society, a settler society, without a civil war, and without any of the fundamental conflicts that most societies face. Now, this has been needn't have happened. We can take the example of Argentina.
Yeah.
Well, at the beginning of the 20th century, you had a very similar situation between Australia and the Argentine, and both seen as very progressive and you might say were in its paradises. Then you can look at the history of what happened in Argentina over the 20th century compared with Australia. And then you can say, well, this was not nothing that was achieved. This was an enormous achievement. Now, Gallipoli has a certain resonance, but but the fact that the other is taken for granted, as you put it, is an enormous achievement.
No issues, no questions. Yeah. One question, then we have to go. Oh, aren't you?
Got mine
I have two. One is a factual question, and then
Yeah, sure.
I want to sort of quibble a little with the myth part.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I'm looking at this list, and given those numbers, why is it a foundational Australian group? There's a lot of groups that it's not clear to me how it's a foundational. It's sort of, I think, a factual question, but a factual question more good. And then,
can I answer that one, then your follow-up question? It's foundational myth because of what I didn't have the opportunity to talk about today, which is the battlefield and the peculiar behaviour of the Australian troops on the battlefield, which needs, it's no easy way of summarising that, otherwise you fall into sort of glib heroics, which wasn't the case at all. But I think David alluded to that in one of his comments about before. And there is something very peculiar about that behaviour. The most extraordinary stoicism under fire that generates immediately, almost instantaneously, in kind of war reportage, not glorification of the behaviour of soldiers, Australian soldiers. There's something very exceptional about that behaviour that becomes instantaneous. Everybody recognises instantaneously, observers on the battlefield recognise that there's something really very exceptional going on there. And that immediately generates a kind of a thread in this story that makes it exceptional. And that's the reason.
And the mythical question is the way you end here.
Yeah.
Feels a lot like the Iliad.
Yeah.
Kind of peters out. Nothing's over.
That's right.
Right?
Exactly. That's it. That's
But
precisely it. Yes.
But I don't think the Iliad is a Greek founding myth, or at least it's not without the Odyssey too. And that's what I'm missing here. There has to be an Odyssey to explain. I mean, they're not necessarily Greeks going over there. There's all these different names for all these different people from all these different places. Odysseus' homecoming starts to mark what makes us Greek, and everywhere he lands, he wants to know are the Greeks there or not. So it's not a founding myth without an Odyssey. I miss the Odyssey.
And that again is something that I have thought about, and I think this is kind of useful discussion both with David and Agnes's question about the constitutional law side of things and your question about the Odyssey. And so, I mean, I actually very much kind of welcome these as, I mean, it helps me to understand not merely what's missing, but what I kind of have thought about over the past about how you construct this. Because, I mean, essentially I agree that in this account here, that I don't touch upon the Odyssean elements. And when I first began thinking about this, which goes back about 10 years, I mean, this is kind of, I've been thinking on and off about this question. And there, I first started to think about, I guess, when I was doing the book on civic justice, and you'd actually read an Australian chapter which the American publishers chopped out of that. And I was probably thinking about it in Odyssean terms then. And really what you are inciting me to do is to return to some of that thinking. And in fact, I mean, there is in subsequent work that I did on Alexandria and Cavafy and so on, I know in thinking about that, I've been thinking about the Odyssean elements of the Australians in this part of the world, in the, the Near East, as it used to be called. And I can't precisely say off the top of my head what the Odyssean elements are, because I mean that's for another paper. But you're perfectly right. And I have to say, just this is a glib. Let me give you a glib response to this. there is an element of the annual pilgrimage of Australians to the Gallipoli Peninsula, including the louts and beer drinkers and so on, which is also part of the Australian character, I have to say. It has a pilgrimage and I suspect a homecoming aspect to it. And that's my kind of glib, off the top of my head response to something which is actually more important. I promise you that as this develops, I will address that. And it's actually quite powerful.